Welcome to the Hudson Institute. I'm Bryan Clark, a senior fellow at the Institute and director of the Hudson Center for Defense Concepts and Technology. We are lucky today to have with us Congresswoman Elaine Luria from Virginia's 2nd Congressional District. In addition to being a 20-year Navy veteran, a surface warfare officer, Representative Luria is vice chair of the House Armed Services Committee and serves on the Seapower subcommittee, as well as other committees in the House, where she is very active in defense issues and national security issues. So we're here today to talk about primarily the Navy, but also national security writ large. The name of the event is Righting the Ship. We're trying to talk about how the Navy might be able to get its sea legs under it and restore its ability to secure U.S. national security, as well as secure the waves for and the waters for all of our international partners and allies. So thank you very much for being here with us, Representative Luria.
Well, thanks for having me back again.
So to start out with, we're here in Washington waiting for the FY 2023 budget to arrive from the DoD, which is reportedly not going to be very generous to the military services. It sounds like they're all being asked to make some pretty hard cuts, the Navy in particular, and they're not going to be getting an increase. It doesn't seem, though, like the world has gotten that news that we want to maybe curtail our defense spending. We've got Russia on the doorstep of Ukraine threatening invasion. We have China making regular aggressive overflights of Taiwan. We have North Korea launching hypersonic and ballistic missiles to test those out and threaten their neighbors. And we also have Iran, who is mounting a effort to support the Houthis in their effort against the Saudi Arabians and other Gulf allies, as well as fielding a large array of unmanned vehicles that they're now distributing to their non-state actor allies around the Middle East. So lots happening in the world from a security perspective. Seems like maybe the administration is not necessarily taking that on board when it comes to this defense budget. And then also in the national defense strategy that we're waiting to see, which is going to focus on this idea of integrated deterrence. So how do you see our current situation, and where do you think Congress is going to have to step in and try to maybe make up for some things that the administration might not solve in the course of this budget and strategy?
Well, going into the next year's budget, I feel like it's going to be sort of a repeat of what we just saw, but perhaps worse. I think going into the budget, which let's just be straight. I mean, we're on a CR 5 months into the current year, and we haven't even passed the budget, but we did pass the NDA, the National Defense Authorization Act, the defense bill, and we had to do a considerable plus up to that. I think we went into that budget cycle saying that we needed to see a 3 to 5% increase in real dollars, and that wasn't included. And since we like to focus on the Navy, I mean, there were significant cuts in shipbuilding, an effort to decommission 7 cruisers, 4 LCS, essentially 15 ships overall. And we have every leader in the military coming before us saying we need to grow the size of the Navy in order to respond to China and their rising aggression. And so everything I'm hearing from inside the building is that this year is going to actually be worse. And it's notable that, and it was in a very bipartisan way. I worked with Mike Rogers, the ranking member from Alabama, and ultimately we had a good bipartisan group supporting that plus up, because I think we overall as Congress recognize the fact that we need to make these investments. And you listed a long list of things that are our current and ongoing national security concerns, and that certainly wasn't even all inclusive. There's even more and more places in the world where we have a focus and we have a presence. And this may go back to some things people have heard me talk about before, but as a member of Congress, what do we want to hear? We want the services to come to us and essentially say, this is what we need, this is why, and most of all, this is the risk of not doing it. And I think that is a portion of what has not been communicated. I've been clear that I feel that there's a lack of a maritime strategy, and I think it's very important to understand what the strategy is. Where do we need our forces? What type of forces do we need? We've gone years without a 30-year shipbuilding plan, and I think the previous administration had a good focus on what needed to be done for the Navy, but it came so late in the administration that now, with these reviews of national defense strategies, nuclear posture review, kind of all of these things with the new administration and potentially a pivot on some of those, we're kind of starting over again without really understanding what the future of the fleet looks like. And last year, what did we deal with? This divest to invest strategy. And I really want to pivot on the urgency with which we need to to have a force that can respond and react. And a few thoughts going through my head. So stepping back a little bit, I mean, you talked about this integrated deterrence. And if I sit here and think about integrated deterrence, is this just the newest buzzword?
Right.
What is integrated deterrence? Can anyone clearly define what it is? I mean, and I understand from some comments made in the administration, folks serving in this Defense Department, that it's an idea of integrating all of the levers of government. But don't we always do that? I mean, why is this something new? And so is this just going to be a sort of a new buzzword that we kind of repackage things under? But the truth is you have to actually have the deterrence. You have to have the forces. And I felt like last year's budget, we were going to cut the fleet that we have today in the hopes of a future capability that we were going to develop, and that on the heels of 2 decades of lost shipbuilding opportunities. So that's very concerning in the outlook that I have going into the budget this year.
Yeah, absolutely. And so to stop on integrated deterrence for a second, it seems like with with the approach that we're taking currently to Russia, it seems like the integrated deterrence that we're approaching it with is mostly economic and diplomatic, and not really the military dimension being employed. So when they say they're trying to integrate all the elements of national power to deter an aggressor, it seems like we have a test case right in front of us where we're not actually using all those tools. And it seems like the Navy could be one of those tools. And if we had a strategy for how the Navy was going to be employed as part of a overall national defense strategy, that might be a good way to start arguing for what the fleet of the future should look like. Is that what you're looking for maybe in the NDS, is at least an inkling of what the role of the maritime services are as part of this overall strategy of integrated deterrence?
Definitely. And, I think that there's really a bigger question. And the bigger question is, what is our role in deterrence in the sense of, is the United States going to react? And I think there's parallels that we can talk about on the legal side, specifically about defense obligations to other countries, which are allies and partners. And for example, Ukraine not being a member of NATO, so there's no Article 5 requirement, that we would come to the defense of Ukraine. And I really don't think anywhere across the political spectrum people are arguing for boots on the ground in Ukraine. And I do think that there are levers of our government. We have provided security assistance. We did 60 million, additional 200 million in defensive weapons in support of Ukraine. I think we've redoubled and shown our resolve to our NATO partners. We do have a carrier strike group operating in the Mediterranean, the Harry S. Truman Carrier Strike Group, doing exercises there, and we are considering potentially providing additional forces to reinforce our NATO allies, across Europe, and potentially maybe focus on the Eastern European countries that are members of NATO. And so obviously our ultimate goal in this situation is to hopefully see a diplomatic resolution. And in any circumstance that we would not want to have anything escalate to conflict. But the fact that we really don't have, in my mind, an overarching strategy globally for where and how our forces operate and how that is part of a greater deterrent is really what I'm focusing on. And I think you could shift to the Pacific and have a very similar conversation. Just up front, I think that our current policy of strategic ambiguity it's time to change that. I think that we need to provide strategic clarity. We need to be very clear and unambiguous and say that the United States will react in order to maintain the status quo. And I think that something like that should be the foundation of building this national defense strategy and what deterrence looks like in the Pacific, what our force looks like, and essentially taking into account as well the urgency of the situation. We all know what Admiral Davidson and then Admiral Aquilino said, that China could try to take Taiwan by force in the next 6 years. That was a year ago, so in the next 5 years. And very interestingly, yesterday there was a senior academic who advises the President Xi in China, who was quoted as confirming that Davidson window and saying that a time frame of 2027 was very essentially very much within the realm of what they were considering, and putting that in context of other events happening in the near term in China. And so I think there's a big disconnect. I mean, if you go and sit down with Admiral Aquilino, Admiral Paparo, and get an update on this is what's happening in the Pacific, there's a gray zone conflict that's happening every single day. And the Chinese are testing us, they're testing our allies. And they very clearly know one way or another in their mind. They either think the United States will come to the defense of Taiwan or not. We think about it. The strait is like 120 miles. This doesn't take very long to cross the strait, but the president essentially has no authority to react right now in order to defend Taiwan. If you think about the War Powers Act, you can't introduce forces in places where their hostilities are likely. U.S. forces are not directly attacked. There's really nothing. And then the Taiwan Relations Act, doesn't have a mutual security requirement. And so I wrote an op-ed a few months back about how the president's hands are tied, and so I think we as Congress have a role. Like we need to have a debate, and we need to be very clear and unambiguous. That I think that we should say that we will come to the defense of Taiwan in order to maintain the status quo, and we need to put our forces and coordinate that in the Pacific with our allies in order to support that commitment.
So you think a legislative solution might be appropriate to kind of force the United States' hand, to kind of make it clear that we're binding ourselves to the defense of Taiwan in a way that the Taiwan Relations Act does not really, because that's more about supporting Taiwan in its own defense rather than defending it ourselves. So given that, then that would lead us to some kind of national defense strategy that articulates how those military forces are going to get employed to support that defense. Which I think, as you noted, is going to require a change in posture. I mean, right now, our forces are not necessarily postured in such a way that they could respond in a relevant time period to an attempted bombardment, invasion, blockade of Taiwan. So, are you looking for that kind of change in posture to be articulated by the White House as part of its overall national defense strategy? And then what would be the implications you see in the in the budget and what's being presented to you over on the Hill in this 23 budget?
So that is what I'd like to see. I don't have any indications from what I sort of know from people inside the building about what we might anticipate seeing in the upcoming budget. That is an indication of what will be there, and or really any idea that there'll be that strong of an affirmation and commitment to the defense of Taiwan in any national defense strategy that's being drafted. So, that is what I would like to see. I know that other colleagues of mine on the Hill, share that, but I don't anticipate that it will go that far. What am I expecting to see? Kind of more of the same from last time. I mean, I think there'll be cuts to shipbuilding in particular. And we're really facing a cliff with regards to the surface fleet. If you think about the number of DDGs reaching their 35-year service life, I think I read that in 2020, starting in 2026, there's going to be 27 DDGs that are coming up at the end of their service life. And I know the Navy had been, analyzing service life extensions, modernizations. I think it's criminal what we've done over the years with the cruisers, but realistically, the last budget, or the last NDA, they attempted to decommission 7. We did preserve 3. And honestly, based off the material condition of some of those hulls, it was 3 or 4 was the number that made sense at this point in time. But we really do need to look at the composition of our surface fleet. And when they send over a budget that wants to build 1 DDG, I mean, the DDG is the ship that we can build on time, on budget every year, and have been able to for a long time. So we need to commit to building what the industrial base can support. The DDGs, get the FFG program online, potentially expand at the appropriate time to a second yard for building FFGs. I mean, the National Security Cutter, I kind of hear that they're going to stop at 11. Why don't we do 12 and then double that to 24? And whether those are within the Coast Guard or the Navy, I mean, it's a platform that we can build, and I think we need to leverage everything that we can build and everything that we have currently to add to the mix.
So it's I think what I'm taking away from this is the strategy of divesting to invest, which seemed like a logical approach. Doesn't necessarily make sense if you think your adversary is gearing up for an action that's maybe in the more of the near term, like in the next 3, 4, or 5 years. That doesn't make sense anymore. We've got to shift our focus to trying to retain the force structure and capabilities that we can have in that late this decade time frame, which means we probably have to make some hard choices about some technology development efforts that are very sexy and that people want to go do, but...
Well, can we talk about that for a second?
Yeah, I was going to ask about that.
So when people come and say, like, the future of defense is AI and quantum computing. I mean, that sounds great, but I'm like, what weapon system is that? How do you use that? How do you implement it? So I feel like, we just have a continuous flow of these sort of overarching visions and programs that don't really materialize into a real network and architecture, i.e. of platforms and how they communicate and target that's envisioned. So I mean, some of my colleagues potentially on the Armed Services Committee who don't maybe have direct experience operating ships and a lot of the weapon systems, they'll kind of get a brief on this. And we're going to have an ability to see everything in the Pacific and push a button over here to shoot a missile over there. And it sounds great and like something you could definitely see in sort of a movie of the future. But the truth is first of all, you can't get rid of all the platforms, all the ships that have the missiles in order to do that. So if they want to call every ship that floats with a missile and it's manned by people as legacy, you have a starting out problem there. And I certainly do think that we need to invest in technologies of the future. I think there are certain applications where unmanned, has distinct advantages, and actually unmanned aerial and undermanned undersea platforms I find potentially more useful than some of the concepts that have been presented for the use of unmanned surface vessels. But I think the technology is promising in the future, but we honestly can't divest of everything we have today. Every ship with people on it and missiles and air defense and anti-submarine and every capability. But we also, I think, are always shooting for like the newest, fanciest thing. And if you think about this situation and what we could do to help Taiwan defend themselves, they're not particularly complex things. And so I actually had an opportunity in hearings last year to ask the Air Force, so what are you doing in the Pacific? So what about LRASM, long-range anti-surface missiles? How many of those are you planning to acquire this year? And that's kind of a game changer. You have platforms that can deliver that, and so it was something that wasn't at the threshold that the people providing testimony, the Secretary and Chief of Staff of the Air Force, were able to readily, provide information and show that that was a priority program. What about mining capability? You're talking about stopping essentially an amphibious assault. Providing mining capability and having adequate offensive mining capability. It's not complex, it's not expensive, but we don't prioritize it. And so I think that the big picture here is going back to a strategy. Like, what is the strategy? Is the strategy actually stopping the invasion of Taiwan? And if so, what forces do we need? What weapons do they need? Where do they need to be? And how do we generate those forces with what we have today? While adding, albeit at a very slow rate, in the time frame we have to that number of platforms. And we absolutely have to build our submarine force. I mean, that is the area where we maintain a strategic advantage. And we added resources in last year's budget to try to speed up to 3 Virginia-class a year. But I mean, I know the challenges within the industrial base, both at Newport News and Electric Boat, and both on the new construction and sort of the repair and maintenance side of that. But then again, what are we doing on the repair side, essentially, for both surface ships, submarines, aircraft carriers? We always want to make an investment in a new platform. But do we make the appropriate investments in the repair and industrial base to get the most out of the platforms that we have? And I won't repeat, because probably a couple years ago when we did this, I talked a lot about OFRP, Optimized Fleet Response Plan, but essentially how we deploy. We've got to think outside the box. We get a lot more presence out of our forward deployed forces, our FDNF forces. And we've replicated that model in several other places. I mean, we have ballistic missile defense. We have missile defense platforms, operating out of Rota, that operate on a similar schedule. And then we've put crewed as ships on the East Coast in this Project Greyhound to do that, kind of to deal with the Russian submarine threat in the North Atlantic. And so if we can get more out of our platforms and operating them in a different way, we need to look at that model not only for forward basing, but for CONUS-based ships in order to be able to have the availability to, rapidly respond. So I mean, I feel like those kind of questions get left out of the discussion of what the Navy is asking for when they come to Congress.
I mean, it seems like what we're seeing is the urgent situation is not translating into more creative solutions on the part of the Navy.
Well, so in the urgency of the situation, so this is something that I've pushed for, and I've publicly said a few times that I think is absolutely essential. I mean, I think that Admiral Aquilino, the U.S. Indo-PACOM commander, needs to brief the president personally. And I think that this is our #1 defense issue, and I think that the sense of urgency that you get from the commander in the theater. So if Admiral Aquilino, Admiral Paparo could sit down with the president and brief him directly, I think that the level of urgency, concern, and the investment in this, we could clearly see that go up. And I've voiced that to several people in the administration, and would really like to continue to push to make sure that that can happen.
Right, because it seems like we could rebalance a little bit in the budget and say, well, maybe we won't invest quite as much in R&D, and we'll shift some of that money to current readiness of the force and maybe procurement of the platforms we're already building. But that's not a huge shift in when it really comes down to it. So you really need to probably increase the defense budget some amount to accommodate the fact that we need to sustain today's force while building more of the current generation of capabilities, if we really think this is a 2020s problem that we're trying to address. So it's not just a matter of shifting money around; it's also a matter of more money, which has to be a White House decision. Because I think one of the things, obviously, the Congress added $25 billion to last year's defense budget or appropriation, or still in the process of being appropriated. But that's all. You're adding money onto existing programs. You can't create some new program. You can't come up with some new operational concepts. So it really is limited the impact of that money because the DoD didn't bake it in at the start. And is that what you're looking for, is the DoD to try to bake in some of these more creative solutions as opposed to waiting for Congress to add the money in at the end?
Well, I think that we all feel like it's a shell game.
Yeah.
If the Navy comes to us and said we only want to build one DDG this year, but the other DDG is the first thing on your unfunded list, it's I just want the Navy to come to us and say, this is what we need, this is why, and this is the risk of not doing it.
Right.
So essentially a strategy that is understandable, that is briefed, and backed up by their request. And if they say, here's the 40 things that we still need that are not within this budget you've given us, then it's on Congress to make a decision about the risk of not doing those things. But if it's never articulated, I went back and watched some hearings where John Lehman was briefing the Senate in the 1980s, and it was very clearly this is the maritime strategy. And this many ships in the North Atlantic, the Mediterranean, the Pacific, added up 15 carrier battle groups. And essentially where the discussion went is, this is what we need, it equals 600 ships, and here's the risk of not doing that. And that's just not being communicated in that way. And so if it's all just numbers and 30-year shipbuilding plans when we get one that aren't put into context of what that means, what presence that delivers, and what deterrence that equates to with regards to China potentially trying to take Taiwan by force, then it's not being communicated in a way that's compelling. And it's not just within Congress. I think that the American public, how do we get that conversation outside of the room here, or the people who might be, interested in listening normally to a conversation like this? I mean, we really need to get that message out to the broader public about the importance of a Navy. This investment is really one of the most important investments that we can and should make for our national defense and our economy. And sort of, do you want the Chinese to sort of take over as the world influencer, or do you want the United States to maintain our role? And I think that really, if you think about what would it mean if China invaded Taiwan, kind of what follows from that. And I think that that's not acceptable to any Americans or any of our allies. So I mean,
so there's some interesting points to what you were discussing there. So I think so one thing it seems like from what John Lehman did, and he's got a great piece in Proceedings this month talking about this, but articulated the strategy, how they intended to employ the Navy, and then also the operational concepts, like how is the Navy going to operate? What do the forces do when they're out there? It's not just a matter of floating around and magically deterrence happens out of that. There's a set of tactics and employment concepts are going to use. So that's the kind of explanation it seems like the Navy needs to be making to Congress, but also to the American public, is to say, it's not just a matter of the Navy's great, rah, rah. It's, the Navy does these things, here's how it does it, and this is what their implications are for the kinds of force structure we need.
Buy-in from the top. I mean, the reason that we built a 600-ship Navy and that the plan, which, Lehman didn't come up with the plan. I mean, Admiral Hayworth before him, I mean, it was underway. But the truth is we had the commitment from the top, from the president, and President Reagan made that commitment. I would like to see President Biden make a similar commitment, because this is a situation that requires similar attention, resources, and of similar importance to our future national security.
Which comes back to the national defense strategy, because it seems like we may be hoping in the defense strategy to come up with some judo move that allows us to deter China without necessarily having to have the robust military posture in the Western Pacific that I think you're arguing we need. Do you see any way for that to be effective? Some combination of economic and diplomatic and information tools being able to deter or dissuade China when it comes to Taiwan?
Those are all tools that we should use and are really using on a day-to-day basis in our relations with allies and adversaries. I mean, this is kind of all parts of the government need to coordinate together. And if you look at legislation that we're even considering this week in Congress, that is really China competitiveness related legislation that's already been passed in the Senate. And the House, will be considering a similar version of that legislation. I mean, that is really addressing the economic and the human rights and the environmental issues, which are all very important. So kind of, it can't be just defense. It has to be all of those things. But a national defense strategy is really, in my mind, should focus on the defense element of that plan. And whether it's diplomatic or economic, other departments and agencies, put that together. And I would say the National Security Council, like they implement and integrate all of those things into a national strategy.
Right. So it's interesting. I will take a short tangent here, if it's okay. The America Competes Act, which is the counterpart to the USICA, which is the U.S. Innovation and Competition Act that was passed in the Senate. It includes several elements that try to restore some industrial strength when it comes to like microelectronics and semiconductors in the United States, and increase our capacity for that. It seems like that's actually semiconductors are a particular area that might be an opportunity to maybe deter China, because TSMC, the world's largest semiconductor manufacturer, is in Taiwan. That prize, is maybe very attractive to China, and if its leverage or its market share was not quite so high, maybe it wouldn't be quite as attractive a prize. Do you see tools like that being a useful element of an attempt to try to make Taiwan less attractive, or maybe making it as less of a prize for China?
Well, I think it could in a very long-range scenario. I think it would take a very long time to build up a capacity to provide that supply, either in the U.S. or with our close allies. And so, I certainly think that we should do that. We shouldn't have a dependence on, certainly on semiconductors or other critical parts of our supply chain. We shouldn't have that dependence essentially on the Chinese, or in a scenario where it is at risk of potential future Chinese action. So I think it's important to do, but I don't necessarily know that the timeliness of it would apply enough leverage to put that into the calculation.
Right. That makes sense. So another industrial base issue, kind of pivoting back to the discussion about readiness, is the ship repair capacity of the United States, both on the government side when it comes to nuclear-powered ships, and then the private side when it comes to surface combatants. It's obviously inadequate, not because those companies suck, but because there just isn't enough capacity, because we have not incentivize them to build it up.
They'll surge to meet the demand. I mean, if we want to build ships, we will have companies that build yards to build those ships. And you've seen that. I mean, there really are two relatively new yards, both in Wisconsin and Alabama, that came out of relatively new programs, and then now are sort of pivoting to additional capabilities. So.
Right, but both are challenged. I mean, Austal in particular is challenged because they're running up against the end of their LCS production. They're building the new salvage and towing ship, but they're going to now have to compete with a bunch of other small Gulf Coast shipyards to get that next class of ships so they can stay in business. I think on the ship repair side, you've got some. Austal has a new repair yard actually in San Diego, I think. But the capacity of the repair yards is not increased dramatically over the last decade. Have these companies voiced concerns to you about how the Navy runs that ship repair business, and how they could better support them, or what? I mean, I'm trying to how do you get them to grow their capacity?
Yeah. So 1/4 of the shipbuilding and repair happens in Hampton Roads. So I very frequently talk to people involved in this, and there's two elements to it. I mean, there's the public yards, and the public yards with the capacity for repair of nuclear-powered ships. And so, I thought a lot about kind of where did this bottleneck happen? And essentially around the time that we got to an all nuclear powered carrier fleet, so we got rid of Kennedy and Independence and Kitty Hawk, and we ended up with an all nuclear powered fleet, was around the same time we were downsizing the number of nuclear capable public yards as well. And I think we've struggled to keep up with the demand. And I think about an example, CVN 77. So right around the time I came into Congress about 3 years ago, I went and visited at Norfolk Naval Shipyard, and CVN 77, the Bush, was in for their first docking avail in their life cycle. And so when the Nimitz class was designed, that was supposed to be a 10.5-month DPIA. But do you know how long Bush was there for? I mean, at this point in time, they were projected to be there for 27 months. I'm not sure exactly how the timing worked out. But why was that? It was a cascading thing because they had to do the MTS conversion, so converting, sort of new submarines to be these moored training ships for the nuclear power training program. And, so, getting into all the details of it, it was really just a backlog, like too much work for the capacity of the yard. And so we made investments a few years ago in hiring additional workers for our public yards, and it was several thousand. And I think, they've accomplished that, but it does take a long time for people to acquire the skills and the capacity and volume. Another thing is modernization of our yards. I mean, if you go to Norfolk Naval Shipyard, for example, and I mention that one just because I'm the most familiar with it, having spent time there myself on the Harry S. Truman as, in their first PIA, which we finished a day early. And I, as a lieutenant, I'm like, my gosh, everybody's celebrating a day early. This doesn't seem like a big deal, but in the big scheme of things, finishing a PIA a day early is a big deal. But we look at the infrastructure there, and not only sort of the modernization of it, but the physical impact of things like sea level rise and recurrent flooding.
Right.
I mean, some of the dry docks at Norfolk Naval Shipyard were built immediately post World War I.
Yeah.
And so they have to have these temporary seawall caissons every time there's a storm that is coming in on the East Coast. They have to reflood the dock and remove all the services. So you had weeks and millions of dollars to an availability, which all operational commanders over here waiting for the ship to deploy. So I think we need to make smart investments in shipyard modernization. And we have sped that up. And at Portsmouth Naval Shipyard, I think there are some big projects underway relative to that. So we need to look at that, both the facilities, the workforce, the modernization, but we also need to be able to invest in our private shipyard capability as well in order to support that. And we've gotten in a situation with our nuclear submarines, for example, where we've exceeded the capacity of the public shipyard, so we've put some of that over to Newport News and Electric Boat. I think it took a long time for that to ramp up because, and I said to the folks at Newport News, like, you built the submarine, can't you just fix it? But I understand there's like different infrastructure and capability to get that up and running. But we're just demanding a lot.
Yeah.
If you look at one carrier and refueling, one carrier finishing everything up to deploy for the first time, i.e. Ford, and we're going to be coming up on the fact that Nimitz is going to be decommissioning not that far off.
Right.
And so you just kind of keep adding and adding and adding on top of what they're doing with, building, repairing, decommissioning, refueling. There's only so much capacity physically on the waterfront. And then we're trying to speed up the construction of Virginia-class submarines. And we hadn't gotten to this sooner, but it really is the most important thing is the Columbia-class staying on track. Because, and maybe this isn't clear enough in what I've seen, to date in this integrated deterrence thing, but like the nuclear deterrent is the cornerstone of our national defense, and we have to keep Columbia on track because obviously we know that's the most survivable leg of the triad. So.
Absolutely. So, interesting you brought that up because, of course, the shipyards building it in Newport News and up in Groton are both challenged to build the Virginia class at the same time, as well as now take on repair work of the LA class mostly. Being able to do all that is going to require investment, which has been made. So there's been a lot of investment made both in the shipyards by the government as well as in the supplier base, which is sort of we've put some extra care there because of this concern in part about Columbia. I think the Navy is already looking at ways to mitigate the potential impact of a Columbia delay about what we can do with the existing Ohio class to extend their lives and change how they're managed. So that's something that might be able to be dealt with if it does turn out to be on the back end.
I had some good conversations at Naval Reactors about how they're trying to assess these timelines. And if there's anything I hear across the waterfront in ship repair, it's level loading.
Yeah.
And then if you look at the just conventional repair industrial base, for example, across the waterfront in Norfolk, and all of a sudden you come out with a budget that says we're going to decommission 7 cruisers.
Yeah.
So we're going to do all this to build it up, build a workforce that can support all of these modernizations, and then just pull the plug. And so you really get in a situation where you're spending a lot of money to build capacity, to build the workforce, yet it's changing. There's a sine wave, and not a predictable one either.
Right, and for the private yards, that's really hard because they are completely funded by private money, and they're dependent upon each one of those contracts coming from the government for a availability or a set of availabilities, which we've vacillated on the contracting mechanism we use for that, from multi-ship, doing multi-ship contracts to single-ship contracts to now kind of a hybrid between the two, and it's hard for them, I think, to make those capital investments and be able to invest in workforce in an environment where it's hard to hire people on the spur of the moment. So one other question on the shipyard. So there was news earlier this week, or I guess last week maybe, there's a consortium in Ohio that's looking to build a nuclear-capable shipyard on Lake Erie and a depot to go along with it to do repair work, or I guess foundry kind of work, or work on equipment. So what do you think about the need? I mean, the need, I guess, is pretty apparent. There's a need. It'd be nice to have another shipyard. What do you think about the path forward on that? And is this something that's getting a 5th shipyard? Is that something that the DoD should be looking at? Whether it's there or somewhere else.
Right. No, and I'm a little familiar. Some of the people who are working on that project provided me some background information on what they're thinking. And so I do think we need to increase capacity. So I don't know if there or somewhere else is the answer. I think a lot of careful analysis went into that based off of available workforce and sort of an industrial capacity within the region, and that's maybe why they centered in on that particular area as an idea. So I do think that the Navy needs to carefully analyze where they can grow capacity, and I don't know that there's any additional capacity that can be grown within the current public shipyard.
Right.
So, I do think that, I mean, and as we increase the number of submarines, we're going to continue to build more Virginia class, and, then obviously the demands of the current LA and Ohio and other class submarines that we have to continue to maintain through the rest of their service life. So.
Right. And then, decommissioning demands are going to be rising as well. As you noted, with the Nimitz retiring, we don't have that down yet either.
Well, and it's a question I've asked. I mean, can you refuel a Nimitz class carrier another time? And we're at the end of the production line here for the refueling of the cores that will eventually refuel 77. So it's a decision that has to be made relatively soon. It was pretty cool. I got to go out to Lynchburg at BWXT and actually see them building the cores. So as a Navy nuke, it's probably pretty nerdy, but actually
that sounds great.
see how they build them. But there is consideration of once you shut down a production line like that for an A4W core, it's not viable to start that up again. So can something like that be considered? And I know that I understand that the Navy is looking at those options.
Right.
And I would really like them to be very forward-leaning on extending service lives of current platforms, both conventional and nuclear if possible, because like I said, there's an urgency and timeliness to this, and we can't just build an entire new fleet in 5 years. So. Right.
So, and it gets to this issue of coming up with creative solutions to address an urgent problem. So those are all things that should be on the table. But when what we see coming over the transom from the Navy is generally, divest to invest. We're looking into the future, like the 2030s are where we solve this problem, which has always been the case. It's always been the next decade is when we solve the problem. So let me turn to a couple of audience questions, if that's okay. I'll call on you, if you could identify your name and affiliation, and then ask your question. We'll start here with this young man in the front.
Justin Katz with Breaking Defense. I wanted to ask both of you to dwell on a comment from the chief of the French Navy. He made it just yesterday. I think it was at CSIS. He was asked about the Russia-Ukraine situation, and he said his assessment is that there hasn't been any abnormal activity from Russian naval forces in the Black Sea. They've been sending their ships in and out, but they've done that for the past decades. We're not concerned. Well, he didn't say we're not concerned, but he said there's no abnormal pattern of life. I wanted to ask if, does that surprise you? Does it not surprise you? And also he mentioned that the focus in the national discussion right now is obviously on the land forces for obvious reasons. Is there a discussion about naval forces in the Black Sea that should be getting more attention, that is not getting attention, so on and so forth?
Oh, I have some thoughts on that. So the Russians have been very creative, or they've been very thoughtful about how they've been ramping up their level of activity in the Black Sea over the last decade, so that we've become acclimatized to it. And now, yes, today isn't that much different than it was maybe 3 months ago. But that's a much higher level of naval activity than existed 10 years ago. And so it's been ramped up this entire time, including submarine operations, which in theory are not allowed under the Montreux Convention, but apparently, if you can argue you're making a port call and your home is in the Black Sea, that you can do it. So there's a lot of activities they've been undertaking that are skirting the existing rules. And ramping up their presence in a way that allows them to establish, a position of naval primacy or naval superiority in the Black Sea relative to other players that might operate there. So yeah, they've done a good job of that, and I would argue that this is a higher level than in the past. It's just not, in the near-term past.
Mm-hmm. And you mentioned the Montreux Convention, and one of the questions that I've frequently been looking at and trying to understand, with Turkey, although a NATO ally, there have been some recent overtures between Turkey and Russia with missile purchases and different things. So, I mean, are we still able, as the United States and as NATO countries, to have, access, to the Black Sea, to those limits that have been placed under that convention? Do they still make sense? And, at what point should we question or examine that? And really the response I've gotten back is that there has been no objection or interference from Turkey with our free access to the Black Sea, with following the protocols that are in place. But the ability, it's sort of a different situation in like what kind of naval presence could you have long term in the Black Sea for non-Black Sea nations. So and I don't necessarily have the day-to-day data of what ships are operating specifically in the Black Sea to see the trend as far as the Russians or other countries. But I think it's important to observe that. And then, something else is, the Russians have become incredibly aggressive recently. I mean, we all operate under Ink Sea, and even knowing back to be an ensign. I remember as an ensign on a DD in the Western Pacific, the first time we encountered a Russian vessel, and the Ink Sea, and the statements that you make, essentially about maintaining safe operations and distance. But they've been really aggressive, both with their aircraft and their surface ships, and how they operate, relative to U.S. and other. I've seen videos with British ships as well. So I'm curious, and if you have thoughts on why they've taken that posture of being so aggressive.
Yeah, they've certainly,
in international waters.
Right, moved away from the kind of more collegial nature that we saw during the Cold War, I think. Robbie, would you like to weigh in on that? Oh, yes, here comes the microphone. While he's getting that, one other thing is to note is that Romania, being a Black Sea nation and a NATO ally, is a country that the U.S. has been trying to foster more maritime capability there, including using UAVs like the MQ-9 or something to do better maritime surveillance of the Black Sea.
Good. Robbie Harris here. I guess I'm wearing the hat today of the SDG coordinator as opposed to other hats. If I may double dip and ask a two-part question. Bryan, you said a few minutes ago that so far we have not exercised the military tools or weapons vis-a-vis Ukraine. But I would remind that the Harry S. Truman strike group has chopped to NATO, and I think that is quite significant. Now, when Congresswoman Luria spoke with SDG this past summer, the 7th Fleet carrier had been dispatched to CENTCOM, and you did not like that one bit. I think now the Harry S. Truman being chopped to NATO doesn't bother you at all, right?
No, I think it is part of a routine deployment for the Harry S. Truman strike group, but they have continued to operate, in the Mediterranean and that general area, rather than, a lot of previous deployments were chopping to 5th Fleet because we were maintaining a continuous presence there. And then shifting to 7th Fleet, I mean, if you saw the pictures recently, probably the largest naval flotilla any of us have seen in a long time, with 2 carrier strike groups, 2 ARGs, and the JMSDF all operating together in the South China Sea. So, I mean, definitely has been an uptick in presence in the Pacific since that last conversation we had.
Good. Thank you for that. Now shifting to PACOM and Taiwan. Congressman Gallagher has an article that was online today from Foreign Affairs, quite a long one, and he cites you in it as well. And he offers any number of recommendations for what could be done, should be done to ready Taiwan. That's just a statement. A colleague of ours in the SDG has argued now for weeks and weeks and months that it is simply impossible for China to mount an amphibious landing in Taiwan. They can't do it today. They probably can't do it in 10 years. Now, they can launch missiles and they can do all sorts of cyber sorts of things, but they cannot do an amphibious landing successfully. Would you comment on that, please?
So, I mean, I think that we should not take for granted their will and their capability to do that. I mean, we know that they do annual exercises every year. We watch that, and all we have to do is see them turn right instead of left one time and cross the strait. I mean, they have the tyranny of distance on their side. They'd be defending on their home front. I mentioned, really, before it's even a question of whether we have ships there to do anything, like we don't have the legal authority for ships that we do have, even if they were strailing through the strait that day, to respond. So I think that there's a lot that we have to do on our side to set our policy. I think that, like I said, we need to move beyond strategic ambiguity and create clarity. Strategic clarity saying that the United States will react in order to maintain the status quo. And we need to have the forces present in the region to react with a timeliness in order to do that. And we need to have the debate in Congress now, not when they're halfway across the strait with their amphibious craft, because of the timeliness of that and the short distance. And so there was a an article that was just published yesterday or the day before in Nikkei Asia, where an academic who's a very close advisor to President Xi had commented, essentially confirming the Davidson window. Mike Gallagher likes to call it the Davidson window. But he did attribute the Battle Force 2025 in that article to me, so we're back and forth. I mean, the good thing is we share each other's views, and I think are trying to amplify each other's views on this. That within that time frame, and that they could do it. My opinion is that the purpose of a deterrent is to make sure that the country contemplating doing something, the cost is too high for them to do it, and they think that they're going to face too much opposition, too much loss in the face of trying to do that. And so with our current presence, with our current legal and sort of political statements of of ambiguity, I think the Chinese see this as a very clear window where they can act, and they're building a fleet to do that. And whether it's a combination of amphibious and missiles and cyber and all of the other tools that they could have at their disposal, I think that they can do it, and they will do it in a time frame where they think they can do it quickly and it won't be protracted, and they can do it before we can show up.
If I could add. I mean, you got a country of 1.4 billion people with the world's largest navy, the world's largest sea lift force, with the largest the largest fleet of ocean-going carriers. There's no reason why they could not invade Taiwan. And it may not be amphibious, but they may pull up to the port in Taipei and say, we're here, we're offloading all these guys, what are you going to do about it? So there's a lot of ways they can go about this that don't involve people running up the beach on the west coast of Taiwan following some kind of bombardment. So I think we got to make sure that we cage ourselves around the capacity of this country and the fact that they may not do this in the way that we would have done it in 1945. But so to your point, it's about making the uncertainty high enough to where they feel like, it's going to be too messy. The chance we might lose face if it doesn't go very well, if it goes slowly or gets somehow disrupted by U.S. efforts. So I think the discussion about denial sometimes makes people think that we could just stop them from doing something utterly, which may not be true. But it's maybe more about increasing the uncertainty and the likelihood that they're going to find it to be the costs are too high for the effort.
Right.
Stand by for an email from Harlan.
He is more than welcome to send it. Other questions, Tom?
Yeah.
Make sure you say your name and affiliation.
Tom Callender, General Dynamics. So in the question, I think you touched on this a little bit at SNA, your speech there with Representative Gallagher. We look at the Indo-PACOM, we look at the threats there, and I think everyone agrees it's more of a naval presence there, what's needed. Yet we're hearing that the next budget is probably going to be worse for the military even more. So I guess your thoughts on, is now the time, do we really need to break away from this unwritten one-third, and say, hey, the Navy should not have to make some of these hard choices. It should be made more, across the Department of Defense. And I guess your thoughts are then in Congress and trying to help the administration or that piece with that.
So unequivocally, yes. I think more resources need to go to the Navy and the Air Force because of the nature of the theater in the Pacific. And I think that essentially, when the services come to Congress and they can't explain why they want what they are asking for, why they need it, what role it's going to play, and what the risk is of not doing it, and then really not even coming and asking for everything that they need. I mean, it's just baked in. Here's the top line. Split it in thirds. The Navy gets their piece of the pie, and they come to us with the best they can do with what they think they're going to get. It's all backwards. I mean, there should be a strategy. The strategy drives the requirements. The requirements drives the POM. POM drives the budget. I think we have it all. It's all backwards the way it's working now, and so they don't really clearly articulate what the requirements are and what the risk is of not supporting and funding those things. So without that, there really isn't a big impetus in Congress. If they come and say 740 is what we need, here's what we need, and if you don't have people who push, You know, the going into last year's, you know, NDAA was that we needed to see 3 to 5% real growth. Well, that's not what came over from the White House. So we kept pushing and we kept seeing what got left off. And so, you know, it doesn't actually have to just continue to be additive. But really the only way I saw a path forward that was even remotely acceptable with regards to the Navy, and when I say that just to stop the hemorrhaging, was we needed to build 2 DGs. We needed to invest in, you know, speeding up the Virginia-class submarine construction. We needed to invest more in Pacific Defense Initiative. We needed to preserve some number of cruisers. I would have liked, you know, for the language is at least 3, so there's some, you know, flexibility there. But, you know, it shouldn't just be up to Congress to tell the Navy, like, hey, we really want to give you more, and let us decide what that is. I mean, they should, the Navy, the services should be coming to Congress and telling us what they really need in the current environment. And so, you know, and if you look at kind of how it played out last year, it really took a bipartisan effort, but everyone on the committee, including the committee chair, was not on board with just de facto adding that $25 billion. I mean, I kind of went behind Chairman Smith's back a little bit with Mike Rogers from Alabama to get Democrats on board, some number of Democrats to make this bipartisan and add it. And, you know, if there's somewhere in Congress today where you have bipartisan consensus, which is like you need to add more to the defense budget to support the Navy, like, let's lean in on that, because there's not a whole lot of areas right now where there's that kind of agreement. So.
Other questions? Yes, sir.
Peter Husey, here with the Hudson Institute. What are the prospects for the fiscal year 22 defense budget that's in a CR now that expires in February? Are we going to get a full up that's going to reflect the NDAA plus up?
So I think that we're on track for that. My understanding is that we are. Now, I am not sure right now that we're on track to come to that agreement to make that happen when this CR runs out on February 18th. So, you know, there's nothing worse than CRs other than a shutdown is worse. But, you know, I mean, CRs, even the benefit of the $25 billion we've added, we've already lost because of the number of CRs that we've had so far, this 5 months into this fiscal year. But I think that my understanding, the sort of four corners negotiations happening in the House and the Senate, is that that will be where we land. I just don't know how long the negotiations will take to get us to that point.
One more question. We have time for one more question.
I've got one. Go ahead.
Oh.
Timothy Walton with the Hudson Institute. Thank you for coming, Congresswoman Luria. Last year in the President's budget proposal, DoD more or less ignored the Indo-PACOM Deterrence Initiative language that recommended heavy investment on resilience initiatives, posture, and the like. Have you had an opportunity to speak with DoD leaders regarding trying to focus to a better degree on the spirit or intent of that language in this year's budget proposal?
Not specifically with the upcoming budget. I mean, they kind of keep it in this sort of cloak of darkness until they put it out. But I have definitely emphasized the importance of that, and I think we also redoubled on that by adding additional funds to the Pacific Defense Initiative in, you know, the plus up we did in last year's NDAA. And then, you know, I think that going back to kind of the whole of government aspect of it, I think that there's really a lot that we need to do in the Pacific and with Pacific, you know, our compact nation partners. You know, such as Palau, for example, and other in Micronesia, that there's commitments and investments that we need to make in those places that may not be defense related at all. Right. But truly they want to stay, you know, allied with the Americans. But when we make a commitment, for example, to fund an elementary school and spend, you know, $1 million to help them, you know, build or repair a school, and we don't follow through on that commitment, those are minuscule investments that can go a very long way. And if you have somebody else who comes knocking with $10 million to say, not only are we going to repair this school, we'll build you 3 more schools and a park and a baseball field, you know, I mean, so I think that we really have to be better partners in those relationships, not only on a military side. I mean, we can't just come knocking when we want to say, like, we want to put forces here, or we want to expand your port so our ships can operate here. But we really need to foster and deepen those relationships on many levels. So Ed Case from Hawaii has some legislation called the Blue Pacific Act, and it actually is included. It's and you know, the rules hasn't met and put it in order yet, but it's looking to be included in this legislation we're looking at passing this year that really focuses on those kind of investments that we can make with Pacific partners. to strengthen these relationships. So there's that, and then there's the hard things, like missile defense of Guam and the specific things. And I really think that there's a place for the combatant commanders to have more of a role in the process of defining the budget. And so long-term thoughts and plans I have, and I may have brought this up before, I mean, I think we're about 35 years on now on Goldwater Nichols, and I think that a lot of the processes that have been put in place need to really be closely examined and determine if we are really, the way our process works now is making the best investments that have the biggest impact for limited resources and best reflect what the combatant commanders know they need in their theaters.
That's a very good point. I mean, that's something we've been arguing in some of our recent studies is the fact that the supplier side of DoD needs to be more tightly coupled with the customer side of DoD, which is the combatant commanders. And right now we kind of treat the combatant commanders as the unnamed, kind of unseen person that receives whatever it is we deliver to them, and without really thinking too much about what is exactly they need today and how do we better integrate those forces and provide them to the combatant commander to be used. So. Tying that supplier-customer relationship better would be certainly an improvement that we could make. And I think one of the things that's happening in this year's NDA that did pass recently was the mission manager, mission integration pilot program. That was something we've been advocating. So that's one area of improvement, trying to get the customer and the supplier tied together more. Well, thank you very much, everybody, for being here. We really appreciate your questions and your attention and your presence here today, and braving the cold and coming out here today. Thank you very much, Representative Luria, for being here. It's been terrific to have you and once again talk about kind of where we are, and hopefully some of these ideas will start percolating over into the Pentagon, and we might see them in this year's defense strategy and budget.
Yes, well, thank you for having me again. I always enjoy these conversations.
Excellent. Well, thank you all for being here, and from the Hudson Institute, have a great day.